We turn for the last Sunday to John's Gospel. We've been studying this wonderful book since May, and today we come to the last chapter, chapter 21, on page 58 of the copy of John's Gospel in front of you. Chapter 21. After this, Jesus showed himself once more to his disciples at Lake Tiberias. This is how he did it. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael, the one from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples of Jesus were all together. Simon Peter said to the others, "I'm going fishing." "We will come with you," they told him. So they went and got into the boat. But all that night they did not catch a thing. As the sun was rising, Jesus stood at the water's edge, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then he said to them, "Young men, haven't you caught anything?" "Not a thing," they answered. He said to them, "Throw your net out on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." So they threw the net out and could not pull it back in because they had caught so many fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment round him, for he had taken his clothes off, and jumped into the water. The rest of the disciples came to shore in the boat, pulling the net full of fish. They were not very far from land, about 100 yards away. When they stepped ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish and bread on it. Then Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net ashore full of big fish, 153 in all. Even though there were so many, still the net did not tear. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. So Jesus went over, took the bread, and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This then was the third time Jesus showed himself to the disciples after he was raised from death. There's one thing you can't do, and that is to turn the clock back. I know you all did so last night, but in fact you didn't get an extra hour. You'll lose it again. You can never have 1 minute back again. We can't have last week back again. You just cannot go backwards. Time is a one-way system, and it goes inexorably forwards, and you must go forwards with it. Now, why do I say that? Because one of the abiding temptations of the disciples of Jesus is to live in the past, to try and recapture that which is gone, to long for good old days, to go back to methods and strategy that grandparents used, and believe in so doing that the cause of God is served, to use out-of-date language, out-of-date methods, and to give the impression to a world that one lived centuries ago. Now, in this morning's study, we have the disciples of Jesus doing exactly the same thing. They were only trying to go back 3 years, that's all. And yet it was such a miserable failure. It happened in Galilee, which was the home of all the disciples bar one. Judas was a man from the south, but all the other 11 came from the north. And it was almost inevitable that after the strain and stress of the last few weeks in Jerusalem, that they'd make their way back home. More than that, they were right to do so because Jesus had told them to go there. As soon as he appeared, as soon as he rose from the dead, the angels, before he said a word, said, "Go and tell the brethren to go to Galilee. He'll see you there." When he came back to them, he said, "I'll meet you again in Galilee." And this very name Galilee, especially to those who've been there, has a lovely ring. It's one of the most beautiful little spots on earth. I remember bringing a party of pilgrims away from Galilee in a bus, and some of them were in tears just at leaving Galilee. There's something about that little lake, 13 miles long, 8 miles wide, shaped a bit like a harp, nestling in the hills of Galilee with the snow-capped Mount Hermon as its backcloth. There's something about that little lake that's just wonderful. They went back to the old country, back home, waiting for Jesus to meet them and tell them what to do next. Now, it was right for them to go back to the old country. It was wrong for them to go back to their old calling. That's what happened. A fisherman who's been away from the fishing for 3 years and gets within sight of a net. A fisherman who's not had a tiller in his hands for 3 years and sees his old boat lying on the beach. A fisherman like that could hardly resist it. And dear old Peter, hanging around the shores of Galilee within sight of those waters and those fish, just couldn't resist it. There are many possible reasons why he said, I'm going fishing. It may be just the pull of the old calling. Whenever I see somebody sitting on a tractor seat plowing a field on a sunlit day with the seagulls following, there's something in me wants to get back on that tractor seat. There's something in all of us that likes to go back with nostalgia and sentiment. Or maybe they were in need of money. Maybe they needed some bread to eat. And so they decided to go out for a night's fishing to try and get some money. Maybe it was just that they wanted something to do, that they didn't like hanging around, doing nothing, waiting for Jesus to come. Or maybe Peter said, I'm going fishing for a much deeper reason than that. Maybe he thought that Jesus would never have him as an apostle now. Not now that he'd denied his Lord. And maybe he was thinking, I'd better go back to a useful occupation. The Lord will not use me as a fisher of men, so I'll go back to being a fisher of fish. I don't know the reason, and it's not important, so we'll move on. If it were important, we'd have been told. But what I want you to notice is this. These were skilled men. They knew their job. They chose the right time to go. Fishing in Galilee is at night. You'll still see the boats going out at night with a hurricane lamp hanging over the stern, and the fish are attracted to the lamp through the water as to a false moon, and they come towards the boat, and then they throw the net out. They still do it. No doubt they used that method in biblical days with an oil lamp. They went at the right time. They went to the right place. Galilee is heavily stocked with fish. It's full of fish. Small though it is, it's one of the most populated lakes in the world for fish. They went with the right equipment. They got nets, they'd got boats, they'd got everything. So they went at the right time, to the right place, with the right equipment. And after about 8 hours hard work, in darkness and cold, they had absolutely nothing to show for it. That in itself is highly unusual. You ask the fishermen today in Galilee, and they always expect some catch. It may be a poor catch, it may be a good one, but to come back with nothing, that is incredible in the Sea of Galilee. So incredible that it's mentioned. Now, why this complete failure? Well, fishermen are notorious at saying it's bad luck when they catch none, and skill when they do. Have you noticed that? I hope I'm not treading on the corns of any fisherman, but if you catch something, of course, you really played that fish well. If you don't, bad luck. They could have said it was bad luck. They wouldn't have said it was lack of skill. They might have tried to find someone else to blame, and in fact, maybe someone else was responsible for their catching nothing. We'll see that in a moment. The main thing is they had failed. Only once before, as far as we know, in their whole fishing career, had they come back after a night's fishing with nothing. Only once before. Now here is the background to this lovely story. They start in a situation of frustration, of fruitlessness, of failure. And they start in a situation of darkness. And the chapter finishes in blazing daylight with a wonderful, fruitful activity for the Lord. There's something about frustration that goes with the night and darkness, and something about success that goes with the day. We are setting out in a mission, and the month of November we're going out fishing. We have been called to be fishers of men, and we're going out. It could be a time of dark. If we come back fruitless, with nothing to show for it, then we will feel dark. There'll be shadows on our faces. But if we come back with a net full, even if it's a dull November day, with blazing sunshine inside. Well, now let's see how they moved out of this darkness. Let's go to stage 2. The dawn came. It comes fairly quickly in the Middle East. The sun comes up over those hills beyond Galilee about 6 in the morning, and there it is. And the lovely pink glow spreads over the hills. You can see the sun on the hilltops first, and then it creeps down into the hollow of Galilee, to the lake, which is some 600 feet below sea level. And the first light of day came, and often you'll find on Galilee a morning mist that just lies in the hollow, and through the mist they spotted someone standing on the shore about 100 yards away, we're told. And the human voice carries very well in a clear, still morning over water. And there are 2 things that Jesus said that strike me as unusual. First of all, look at his question. He calls them lads. Boys, lads. Have you got anything, lads? It's a very endearing term, but it indicates something rather important. That none of the disciples was over 25 at this time. That some of them were still in their teens. We often see pictures, of the bearded old disciples trotting around Galilee, but this is not so at all. When Jesus wanted to get something going, he went for young men in teens and 20s. That's interesting, isn't it? With all their mixed up impulses, with all their misguided zeal at times, that's the group he went for. And I think we have got to say, all of us, that in our day, in the last 2 years, it's the young people who are showing all of us how to get on and fish for men. And some of us who are a bit older in the tooth have got to catch up with the example of young people. I know they may need the wisdom of years. I know they can benefit from cross-fertilization of a balanced fellowship. But Jesus chose teenagers and 20s. And he said, lads, have you got anything? In fact, the form of the question in the Greek is a negative question which expects the answer no. He knew perfectly well there was nothing in the bottom of that boat. In fact, if I translated it literally, he would make it a statement. Lads, you haven't got anything, have you? That's what Jesus said. Lads, you haven't got anything, have you? It's a challenge. It's a challenge to all the people of God. It still rings down through the years. To every church that is not growing as it should, to every Christian who's not bringing others to the Lord, the voice of Jesus comes down through the years. Lads, you haven't got anything, have you? You've been working so hard and spending so much time and money, and you've had so many meetings and you've got so many programs. Lads, you haven't got anything. And then Jesus went further and he gave them some advice about how to put it right. Now, somebody has said the biggest miracle in John 21 is that fishermen took advice from a bystander. Now, once again, you can try that out. If you see a man sitting on the riverbank with his rod and line, just go up and tell him how he ought to do it and see whether he's thrilled to see you. In fact, a fisherman would probably say, get away from the shore, the fish can see you. But Jesus gave them advice. Now, they took it. Why should they take it? I think there's a very ordinary human explanation thus far. Knowing the circumstances, there are 2 unusual features of the Sea of Galilee. One I can vouch for from first-hand experience, one I've only read second-hand. The first-hand experience is this. I went swimming off Capernaum once, and as I swam along, I went hot and cold. And as you swim through the water, you do go hot and cold because the water is hot and cold. There are hot springs all down the western shore of Galilee. That's what caused the hot springs at Tiberias and all the sick people to flood to that area. You can still go to the hot baths there. Some of the springs come up underwater. And so there are patches of warm water in the Sea of Galilee. And as you swim along, you swim into the warm water. And the fish like the warm water. And you can have a patch of warm water full of fish, and next to it a patch of cold water without a single fish in it. The fish are good swimmers too, and they go straight for these warm patches. So the fish can be in patches. And the second fact, which I have not personally experienced, but H.V. Morton describes such an experience in his book In the Steps of the Master, how an Arab called Abdul stood on the shore while his companions went out in a boat about 150 yards, and he stood on the shore to tell them where to throw the net. Because from the shore at that angle, he could see through the water, whereas in the boat they couldn't see down into the water because of the reflection of the sky. And Abdul stood on the bank and shouted out, "Further over, on your right side," and so on. So if that is so, then so far the situation is absolutely normal. And the fishermen on the boat are very grateful to this man on the shore for telling them where the fish lie. So they cast the net. Still nothing dawns on them that is out of the ordinary. And the advice is, throw your nets the other way. Now, fishermen, like everybody else, are people of habits, and every fisherman has the side of the boat that he likes to throw the net out of. He'd rather turn the boat round than get out of his habits. I see a profound lesson here. Jesus is teaching fishers of men something in a way that they'll understand, and it's this: get out of your habits and customs. Get away from your traditions. Do something different. Try something new. And I want to underline this, because I believe that the evangelism of the 19th century won't do for the 20th century. I believe that methods that God may have blessed in the past are not suited to today. And that the Lord is always calling us to listen to Him and do something new. And to break our traditions and our customs and that favorite phrase, well, this is how we do it, or this is how we've always done it. Throw the nets the other way. Do something different. Get away from the past. Don't be hidebound to it. Believe me, the Christians who are going to win people for Christ in our day and generation are those who are prepared to change. Those who are prepared to do a thing differently. Those who are prepared to try something new when the Lord is leading them in a new direction. And the Lord is opening up new methods of evangelism all the time. 2 years ago, you never saw a Christian with a sticker. And yet how much that has made known Jesus to other people. New things all the time. Throw your nets the other way, lads. And so he gave them a new strategy, a new approach, a new method, a new operation. And the result was a new outcome, a new result, new fruit. They threw the net out in the new way, and they took some advice. And it was full. 153 fish. Now, you know, commentators really go to town when they read this. The number of explanations one has gathered as to why there should be 153. Somebody has noticed that it's the addition of every number from 1 to 17. I've not checked that well. And then they've said 10 commandments plus the perfect number 7. Add them together and hey presto. I don't see any message in that. Some have actually found that the name Simon Jonah, which was Peter's name originally, that was his first and second name, that Simon Jonah, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet standing for numbers, if you substitute the number 1 for A and 2 for B and so on, you find that the total of Simon Jonah's name is 153. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. Some have said it means 100 Gentiles plus 50 Jews plus the 3 persons of the Trinity. Another person has perhaps more realistically pointed out that in those days they believed that there were 153 different species of fish to be caught and eaten, and that this therefore is a picture of all the species of men to be caught by fishers of men. Can I give you my own understanding of the meaning of the figure 153, and you can throw it back like a poor fish that's too small, if you will. I believe that the meaning of the figure 153 is, that's a lot of fish. It's a fundamental rule of reading your Bible to take the Bible in its simplest, plainest sense unless you have a good reason for doing otherwise. And the simple, plain sense was that was a good catch for just one throw. And they were big uns too, we're told. And that was a good catch. Now I know that some of you are praying about November mission, and that some of you have been led to this figure, and pray God you may well be right. Be a wonderful catch. There'd be no deep significance in that number, but it'd be a good catch. 153 they caught. And it was then that something began to happen in their minds and hearts. It was John who saw it first. And you know, the disciples are true to character all the way through the gospel. John was the man of insight. Peter was the man of impulse. And they are just the same here. John was the one who sat back and thought about it and who saw and who understood. Peter was the one who did something about it. They were like this when they came to the tomb in the garden. John saw the grave clothes and he understood. Peter ran in. Look what happens now. John understood. There was something supernatural about this situation. Why not a single fish all night and 153 suddenly? That's not just the advice from a bystander. They'd have caught a few that way, but there's something different. Why not one all night and 153? That would be enough to make for the shore and sell. They could finish fishing, and it had taken them just 1 minute to catch enough to sell. Why? And John thought there's something supernatural happening here. There's something out of the ordinary. There's something unusual. And then his memory stirred to a former occasion 3 years previously when almost the identical thing had happened. You can read about it in Luke chapter 5 and verse 4. They had again toiled all night and caught nothing. And Jesus came and told them what to do, and they'd caught a net full. And John said, "It's the Lord." It's the same thing all over again. It's Jesus. Now there is one difference, one tiny detail difference between the first time it happened 3 years previously and this time. Anybody know what it is? Put your hand up. I'm not going to ask you, but if you think you know what it is, put your hand up. Just one little detail. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. About 10 of you. 11. Let me tell you. The first time the net broke, and the second time it didn't. Was that what you were thinking of? Good. Now, don't you see something wonderful there? You know, every detail in the Bible is important. Every word counts because it's the Word of God. What's the significance of that? I think that has deep significance. 3 years previously, Jesus was saying to those disciples, "I can make you effective fishers, but you are not yet ready to pull in the catch. Your equipment isn't ready. You're not mature enough." But now 3 years later, the net didn't break. Now he says you can pull them in. Now you can catch them. Now you can draw the net in, and they did. Isn't it lovely how Jesus tells us things through very ordinary acts of life and events? He gives us a profound lesson. You ready? Are your nets mended, and are they strong enough? As we go out this month. And they drew the net in, and it didn't break. It's the Lord. So from the darkness of frustration, through the dawn of fruitfulness, they came to stage 3, the daylight of fellowship. Let's turn to Peter. I've got a picture hanging in our dining room over our dining table, facing me. I'm at the end of the table that can look at it. It's a picture of an unusual kind. I've never seen any other picture painted of this scene. Some of you have seen it. It's of this very moment where Peter jumps into the water. It's perfectly captured the scenery of Galilee, and there in the foreground is Jesus stooping, poking a fire, and fish and bread cooking. And there's the boat 100 yards out, and the disciples trying to pull the net behind the boat to the shore. And there's Peter halfway between. Dear old Peter, impetuous, lovable as ever. There are two very humorous things now in the story. I hope it's not my twisted mind that sees fun where it isn't, but there are two very humorous things here because they're so human. Number one, that Peter put on all his clothes and jumped into the water. Isn't that lovely? He'd got nothing on but a loincloth. That's what fishermen did wear. They got so wet and so fishy that they would take their clothes off when they went out fishing. But he wasn't respectable like. He wasn't fit to meet the Lord. And that reminds me of one of the dearest saints I know, who Herbert Silverwood. Do any of you know Herbert Silverwood, the evangelist? He was preaching every day on heaven on the sands at Great Yarmouth, and one day somebody persuaded him to go in swimming, and he couldn't swim, so he went in his swimming trunks paddling, and it shelves deeply, and he was swept off his feet very quickly, and the lifeguard had to pull him out and pump him dry while he shouted for help. And when the lifeguard had pulled him round, the lifeguard said, I don't know. He said, I've been listening to you preach all week. And he said, you've talked about the glories of heaven and how eager you are to get there. And he said, the first chance you get to go, you're shouting for help to be pulled back. And dear Herbert Silverwood looked down at his swimming trunks and he said, but I wanted to go decent. Well, Peter had just the same feeling. And Peter and Herbert have a lot in common. Peter said, I can't meet the Lord like this. He'd rather meet the Lord clothed and wet. So he pulled on all his clothes and he jumped into the water. The picture is just so lovable. The impetuous Peter, impulsive to the last. But at least he loved the Lord. And I want you to notice this, that Peter loved the Lord more than the fish. Because the other humorous thing I notice is that the disciples were not going to lose a catch like that. 153, if they talked about it afterwards, nobody would believe them. They were going to bring that to the shore. And they stayed in the boat and brought the fish. But Peter's love was first for the Lord. You can be too busy fishing to love the Lord. You can be too busy evangelizing to jump into the water and say it's the Lord. He's first. Some of you did go into the water last Sunday night here in this building. It's the Lord. You went in, you got all your clothes wet. What did that matter? It is the Lord. It is the Lord. Peter put that first. Love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Then go and love your neighbor. That's the order. And Peter had got something right. So they came to the shore. And they received two things. Further revelation of Jesus. This was now the third time that Jesus had manifested himself to the disciples. And each time was better than the last. Look at the changed circumstances. It made it so much more real. It's one thing for Jesus to appear at night time in a locked room in the middle of a crowded city, but here in broad daylight on the seashore. Not many people have hallucinations at breakfast time on a seashore. This is real. This is for real. They'd thought they'd seen a ghost in Jerusalem in the upper room, and maybe still they were pinching themselves. Did it really happen? Did we really see Jesus for just an hour or two in an upper room in Jerusalem? Was it really him? But you know, ghosts don't cook breakfast and start a fire. And even now, the third time they'd seen him, they still could hardly believe it, and they were wanting to say, is it really you? But they didn't dare to ask him because they knew it was, it says. It captures the uncertainty that they felt so perfectly. None of them dared to say, who are you? Because they all knew who it was. Isn't that a delightful statement? It was real. And every appearance at the resurrection made it more real. So they had a further revelation of Jesus. I will tell you this, if you've been out fishing successfully at the command of Jesus, when you come back you will have a fresh revelation of the Lord. You will be closer to him. If you haven't been out fishing, you'll miss that. And the second thing they got from the Lord was refreshment. He knew that they'd been giving themselves tired through the night. They were weary, they were hungry, they'd been giving themselves. And if you go out this month and give yourselves to others, you'll come back hungry. You will have given your resources away. You will be tired because you'll have given extra time and effort. And Jesus says, come and eat. Where did he get the fish? How did he light the fire? I just don't know. But it is typical of Jesus to be so thoughtful. Again and again at a moment of crisis or need, Jesus knew what was needed. When he raised a little girl from the dead, he said to the mother, go and get a cup of tea. You know, he just seemed to know what was needed. And here he says, come and eat. What a picnic. Sitting on the shores of that lovely little lake, it must have been a foretaste of heaven, to eat with Jesus. You notice there's no wine, because Jesus had promised to be a teetotaler until heaven came. I will no more drink of the fruit of the vine, he said, until I drink it new with you in the kingdom. So there's no wine, but there's bread and fish. And they eat together and have a meal. There's something about a meal. Here's a table spread now. There's something about a meal that makes for fellowship with Jesus. The first thing we do when we get to glory is to sit down at a banquet. It's a mixture of a breakfast and a supper, a wedding breakfast or a marriage supper, call it what you will. But somehow there's something appropriate. On the last night before he died, he had supper with them, but here now he's having breakfast. Supper ends something, but breakfast starts something. And they had breakfast together. When we come together tonight to worship, we'll see what this supper was going to start, this breakfast rather. We'll see what Jesus wanted them to go and do. So you come along this evening and we'll see how this gospel finishes. Let me sum it up. We're facing a mission in November, and I'm going to say a little more after the next hymn about this mission. But we could come back at the end of November in one of two conditions. We could either come back with nothing, tired, depressed, trying to rationalize, as some Christians do, by saying, well, it did us good. That is not the point of a mission. Or we can come back rejoicing, closer to Jesus, refreshed by him, and knowing that he really is alive. Let us pray. Jesus says, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Amen.